Hey everyone, welcome to The Cabin. My name's Alec Britz, and today we're going to be talking about 5 ways to level up your productions. When you're recording in your DAW of choice, I tend to enjoy recording at the -12 to -14 dB mark. This means that when you move into mixing, all of your faders are not all the way down at the bottom. It also has the added benefit of not having to crank your microphone preamplifiers too loud so as to not get too much noise. The next thing is that when you're dragging samples in from Splice or anywhere where you get samples from, a lot of the times they are really loud. So using clip gain to reduce the gain of those independent samples down, I tend to go between -6 and -8 dB, again to get them into that -12 to -14 mark, makes them way easier to work with, and again for the faders to not be right at the bottom of a mix. Session priority. Make sure that everything is named appropriately and how you lay out your session should make sense to you. For me personally, I like to have my vocals right at the top so it's easy for me to do one scroll and I know exactly where I am. Underneath that I have drums and bass, and then the lead harmony instrument, sometimes that might be guitar or keys, and then anything else goes from there. Know what you want before you do anything. You need to think about the emotion across the entire thing. So if you are in a position where you have the song as a voice note, which is always the best place to start, then you can pick what kind of microphones, what kind of instrumentation, and the total emotion that you would like to convey throughout the entire process. When you move from that point of capturing all those instruments into the editing and mixing phase, before you start EQing and compressing, think about how you want the mix to feel. And if there are any individual elements, let's say a snare drum for example, that need to be addressed by adding EQ or adding compression, think about the frequencies that you want to EQ and think about the way you want compression to feel. The next thing I want to talk about is time-based effects. Usually when we talk about time-based effects, we're talking about things like reverb and delay. However, more recently, I've been putting compression into that same bundle in my mind. You see, in the past, I would always be tailoring the release time of a compressor or an attack time of a compressor to where it kind of felt right. And most times I'd get it pretty close, but it never really grooved as hard as when I heard someone like Vance Powell getting a drum kit to just pump in a perfect way. And I always tried to get it right, but it never quite sat there. Until I found a website called Tuneform, and this is not an advertisement in any way, I don't know anybody at Tuneform, but I am going to link it in the description below because this is going to change your life a little bit. What Tuneform allows you to do is type the tempo of the song that you're in into the website, and it gives you all of your subdivisions in a millisecond value. If you are recording something like acoustic guitar, for example, and the guitar is chugging on quarter notes, just banging away, what's nice with the compressor is that you can tailor the release time to be exactly 1/4 note. That way the guitar blooms perfectly over the length of 1/4. And if you do that with the bass guitar, then all of a sudden they start working together in a beautiful way. Carry that through to the vocal and all of your percussive instruments, and even though they might be in slightly different subdivisions of quarters or 16ths or 8th notes or whatever you like, all of a sudden the whole groove of the track starts to lock a bit better. And that's not the front of the note, we're talking about what happens after the initial transient. That way the whole mix kind of just glues and grooves like hell on fire. When we talk about reverbs, often these are displayed in milliseconds or in seconds, and usually we have a short ambient one, and we have a medium one, and then we have a really long one. And the medium one has always been the most tricky for me. This is sometimes in the lower dynamic sections of a song, like a verse. What I've found more recently is by tailoring the length of the reverb to be an appropriate note value, let's say a half bar or a quarter note, all of a sudden the reverb never washes and doesn't really get in the way. That is not to say that there's not a trick for a nice, really long reverb. Something that's great to try out is if you have a long reverb on a vocalist, but you put a compressor on underneath that with the sidechain of the compressor coming from the lead vocal. That way when the vocalist is singing, the reverb is ducking out of the way, and if you get your release time right to be a quarter or an 8th note, then once the singer stops, the reverb will bloom back in time and sustain for an extended period of time. This is a great trick that has really changed the way that I've worked and produced more recently. The next thing I want to talk about is lining up your bottom end. When you have two contrasting low-end instruments, let's say a kick drum and a bass guitar, if they are played perfectly in time and the transients line up perfectly, you get a nice, thick, punchy transient that works perfectly well generally. However, when there's two human beings playing together, those two things don't necessarily line up. And although they might both be in time, the initial transient response kind of smears and causes a strange phase coherence that kind of makes the bottom end feel hollow when those two things operate at the same time. So in the past, I would just flip the phase and it would kind of sound better, but that would be it. But what I found more recently is that if I zoom in and I get the kick drum and the bass guitar or the bass synth to line up at precisely the right moment, I'm not quantizing it, whichever one is taking the groove preference, so that every time they are supposed to be hit at the same time, you don't have any kind of flamming or any strange phasing. A side note to that is when you are using multi-mics on instruments like acoustic guitars or bass drums, then there's a great program called Auto Align that I'll drop in the description below, where you can get the microphones lined up perfectly, especially on close mic things like acoustic guitars and kick drums where you have multi-mics. One of the hardest things to get right is committing. What I found more recently is that once I've done all of my comping and I've got a session absolutely cooking the way I want it to, I have a hard time committing things down into stereo channels. So if you have all of your verse guitars that are rhythm guitars, instead of having 6 different channels, just bounce them into a stereo channel. Do the same for your chorus guitars and your bridge guitars, so that your session starts to get smaller and is easier to manage. Once you've started to simplify all of that, what you'll notice is that all of your faders are kind of at 0 and the mix is cooking the way you want it to. Before starting to automate a lot of the time, I use clip gain to be able to get things that need to punch out a little bit more. I like to use automation more as a very creative tool or as a very repairing tool. Sometimes on a vocal, for example, I'll be automating through different syllables and trying to get something to poke out in a specific way. But if the overall volume and compression of a vocal is in a good place, then that's more of a creative thing. Automating things like reverbs and delays are so important because it adds dimension and it adds depth to a mix. If you have a reverb that's on a vocal, the most powerful thing you can do is to take it away at certain points and to bring it back in. That keeps the listener engaged. So automation is a humongous part of it, but it's so much more fun to automate once you have committed things down, so your session is not enormous, it's just a nice, concise thing to look at and it's easy to manipulate and easy to work with. So those are 5 points that I think could really elevate your productions, and it doesn't matter if you're a beginner or somebody who's been doing this for a long time. Adhering to those basic principles will always help in a really big way. There's a quote that comes to me, and I think it's from Picasso, that says, "Perfection isn't not being able to add anything in. Perfection is not being able to take anything away." I feel like that really echoes through in that whole knowing what you want and adhering to the song. Us as producers can get carried away with cool sounds and cool textures and cool ambiances, but a lot of the time that actually dilutes the initial intention of a song. Thank you so very much for watching. If you have subscribed, thank you so very much for doing so. If you would like to subscribe, please feel free to do so. Most importantly, I hope you're all looking after yourselves and you're being kind. I'll see you soon.